Mr. Thomas Hammarberg, you're looking at Europe from the perspective of the Council of Europe in a time of severe economic crisis, austerity measures being taken. How would you say those measures impact on human rights in Europe, in the EU, but also across Europe?
There's no doubt that the austerity budgets have affected human rights quite thoroughly in a number of European countries, their social rights in particular. We see that vulnerable groups like people with disabilities, elderly people, one-parent families have been particularly targeted, in fact, by the way that the austerity budgets have been decided and implemented in reality. The social security net has been undermined, and this is negative when it comes to social rights.
Would you say then that impoverishment of populations is a case of human rights abuse?
Yes, it is. One very important human right is to have the right to live on a decent standard. This is already in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948. And of course, if you are in a situation of disability, you have the right of some extra support from society. And that type of support is now withdrawn as a consequence of the austerity budgets.
But governments would argue that if the economy is going downhill, then unemployment and to a certain extent impoverishment is unavoidable, and there's nothing that the government should be held responsible for that.
But the question is the distribution of the burden, and people who have already had difficulties to cope and to survive, they should be protected against further attacks and undermining of their standards. And that's a problem, that the austerity budgets have not been shaped in a way to protect the most vulnerable in our societies. The gaps are increasing today as a consequence of these budgets, and that is also having a consequence on social rights.
How would you say, or how would you explain that governments like European governments who are so active in promoting human rights across the world can be so cold-blooded about diminishing the social and economic rights in their own societies, in their own states?
You have to ask them why that is, but it's clear that there is a problem here. European governments are losing credibility when it comes to the international discussion about protection of human rights, because there are so many problems when it comes to poverty and minority rights, treatment of migrants, etc., on the European continent. And of course that's seen by governments in other parts of the world and used in the discussion, for instance in the United Nations.
One of the areas where we've been discussing human rights a lot the past year has been the Arab world, the Middle East. Would you say that the European contribution to the Arab Spring should be to promote human rights? Is that what Europe should do? Or are there other issues that Europe could help in promoting the development of the Arab Spring?
You know, I think the major contribution Europe could give is to ensure that human rights are respected in Europe, in the European countries, so that there will be a respect for the values that are implemented in Europe, and Europe could function as a model, an inspiration when it comes to creating structures, legislation which will protect human rights.
One of the areas where there is at least some tension with implementing the human rights is national minorities, Roma particularly, but also others. Do you see, at least on that level, a positive evolution, or are human rights also under stress in that regard?
Also there, unfortunately, human rights are under stress. We see that as a consequence probably of the economic crisis, the austerity budgets reduced, unemployment increasing, that people begin to be afraid of their own future. And unfortunately, this has also made it possible for some extremist right-wing groups to recruit support, and they target minorities, migrants, and not least the Roma population in their propaganda, and also increase tension in our societies.